Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're tackling something I think many of us grapple with, this idea of self-sabotage.
Yeah, it's a big one.
And our source material uses this really evocative metaphor. The mountain is you. The core idea being that, well, the toughest climbs are often the ones inside us, not external circumstances.
That's exactly it. And what's really insightful, I think, is how it pushes past the simple explanations. It suggests this self-sabotage thing isn't, just random screw-ups or lack of confidence.
Right.
It argues these patterns often come from much deeper places, unconscious needs, maybe unresolved stuff from the past. It's asking us to look, well, deeper than the surface behavior.
So it's less like we're trying to mess up and more like
Yeah.
some kind of internal protection system that's maybe a bit overzealous.
Precisely, a protective mechanism that's gone a little off track.
The material also touches on something interesting, how adversity, like tough times, can actually spark growth. It uses the term positive disintegration, like a forest fire clearing old brush for new life. It sounds like sometimes things need to fall apart a bit to rebuild stronger. Can you elaborate on that based on the source?
Yeah, absolutely. The source describes it as a situation where our old ways of thinking, maybe coping mechanisms that aren't working anymore, they get challenged. They break down under pressure.
Oh, okay.
And that breakdown, while maybe painful, creates the space needed for something new and hopefully more adaptive to emerge. I think about someone maybe losing a job they didn't even like that much.
Right. A major challenge.
Exactly. But then that becomes the push they needed to, say, start that small business they always dreamed about. It's difficult initially, of course, but ultimately leads them somewhere better, more authentic.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Okay, so our mission here today is really to unpack this whole self-sabotage concept. We want to explore where it comes from, how it shows up, and crucially, look at paths toward what the source calls self-mastery.
Sounds good.
Right, let's start with defining self-sabotage, or maybe redefining it. The source initially talks about that classic internal conflict, doesn't it? Like, you consciously want to write a book, but unconsciously there's this fear maybe of being judged that makes you procrastinate. Procrastination is the big example they give.
It is, but then it takes this really interesting turn. It suggests that what we call sabotage is actually serving an unconscious purpose. It's meeting some hidden emotional need.
A coping mechanism.
Essentially, yes. A coping strategy. Maybe avoiding the risk of finishing that book, of putting it out there, feels safer deep down than facing potential criticism, even if it means missing out on the achievement. The material even brings up Carl Jung's fainting, spells a physical reaction, an escape driven by an unconscious need to avoid a difficult situation. It just shows how powerful these hidden drivers can be.
Wow. Okay, that's a really different lens. But if these patterns are unconscious, how do we even spot them in ourselves? Does the source give any pointers beyond just, think about it?
It does. It emphasizes looking for recurring patterns, the same types of situations tripping you up, the same feelings coming up again and again. Becoming aware of those repetitions, the triggers, the feelings, the outcomes, that's presented as the essential first step. Really, it's about mindful self-observation, noticing without immediate judgment.
And then comes the really provocative bit. The material literally says there's no such thing as self-sabotage.
Right. It completely reframes it.
It calls it subconscious self-protection.
Yeah.
So these actions we beat ourselves up over, they're actually attempts, maybe misguided ones, to protect ourselves from deeper fears. Fear of failure, rejection.
Fear of the unknown, fear of success even sometimes, all of those. And it highlights some common ways this plays out, like uprooting, constantly moving jobs, cities, relationships, never quite landing.
Yeah, I know people like that.
Or perfectionism, that's a huge one, where the fear of not being perfect stops you from ever actually finishing or launching anything, like that business idea that's perpetually almost ready.
Guilty as charged
Yeah.
sometimes.
And then there's justification, finding really good reasons or excuses for not doing the thing that scares us.
We're all pretty good at that one, I think. And the source stresses that just seeing these patterns, recognizing them in yourself through honest reflection, that's the absolute starting point.
Exactly. Awareness first, which naturally leads to the question, okay, what's underneath these patterns? What's driving this self-protection?
And that's where emotions and triggers come in.
Precisely. The source suggests we should reevaluate our relationship with so-called negative emotions. Things like anger, sadness, anxiety. They're not just problems to get rid of.
They're signals, like dashboard lights.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, signals pointing towards something that needs attention. An unhealed wound, perhaps, or an unmet need. Anger, for instance, might be telling you a boundary needs asserting or you're not getting the respect you need.
Okay.
And this is where triggers become really useful. The source calls them guides to freedom, when something really gets under your skin instead of just reacting.
Mm.
You pause and you get curious. Why this? Why now? What's the underlying nerve this touched? It uses the example of Lisa. Her intense social anxiety wasn't random. It was a trigger pointing back to a deep fear of rejection from past experiences. Understanding that connection was key for her.
That makes sense. But it's not like all intense emotions are automatically helpful, right? I mean, raw anger can lead to saying things you regret. Does the source acknowledge that?
Oh, definitely. It brings in Linehan's work, actually, emphasizing that emotion regulation is crucial. It's not about suppressing feelings, but about learning to manage their intensity so they don't hijack you and lead straight back into those old, unhelpful behaviors.
Which leads us neatly into building emotional intelligence, or EI. The source links low EI pretty directly to self-sabotage, doesn't it?
Very closely. If you struggle to understand what you're feeling, why you're feeling it, and how to respond constructively, well, you're much more likely to default to those ingrained self-protective but ultimately self-limiting patterns.
Yeah. It mentions dopamine in an interesting way, too. That drive for reward. It can fuel ambition, sure, but apparently it can also trap us in a cycle of always wanting the next thing, making it hard to just feel content with what we have now.
Right. That constant chase can undermine genuine satisfaction. And the source suggests a really practical approach to building EI, focusing on microshifts.
Microshifts, I like that. Not huge, scary changes.
Exactly. No dramatic overhaul needed overnight. It's about small, consistent adjustments. The example given is Tom, who started just like a brief daily journaling practice to understand his frustration at work. Tiny step, but over time it builds self-awareness and better coping skills.
So small things add up. What kind of techniques does it suggest for these microshifts?
Well, things we often hear about but maybe don't always practice consistently. Mindfulness, just noticing your feelings without getting swept away.
Oh,
Self-compassion, cutting yourself some slack, essentially, especially when you stumble.
that's a hard one sometimes.
That really is. And also consciously reframing negative thoughts, catching that inner critic and challenging its assumptions.
Okay, so EI helps us manage the present. What about dealing with the past stuff that might be driving these patterns?
That's where the idea of self-reinvention comes in. The source frames change and growth as natural, even necessary. Resisting that change, trying to cling to who we used to be or situations that no longer fit, that's often where suffering comes from.
Like staying in a job you hate just because it's familiar, even if it's making you miserable. The source mentions an example, Emma, right? Resisting leaving an unfulfilling job because of past instability.
Exactly, that kind of situation. It's driven by that past fear. And this ties into the concept of the emotional backlog.
Social backlog? Sounds like emotional debt.
Kind of. It's all those unprocessed feelings, unresolved experiences we've sort of stuffed down, and they can really weigh on us, holding us back. The suggestion isn't to wallow, but to revisit some of those memories gently. The idea is to offer understanding, maybe comfort, to your younger self, the inner child concept. Techniques like expressive writing, just letting it all out on paper, or guided visualization can help process and release some of that backlog.
Interesting. So cleaning up the past to free up the future.
Yeah.
And speaking of the future, the source talks about actively envisioning it.
Yes. Visualizing your highest potential future self. Getting really clear on who you aspire to become, not just in terms of achievements, but in terms of qualities, values, how you handle things.
And this helps with finding purpose.
Yeah.
Like the example of James, the teacher.
Exactly. That visualization helps clarify what truly matters to you, what your core values are. Then you can start aligning your actions, even small ones, with that vision. It helps you discover or perhaps rediscover your sense of purpose.
And it stresses that purpose isn't just your job title, right?
Absolutely not. It's much broader. It's about the ongoing process of becoming your best self, living authentically, and how you impact the world and others around you, even in small ways.
Okay, so all these threads, awareness, emotional intelligence, processing the past, envisioning the future, they lead towards what the source calls self-mastery.
That's positioned as the ultimate aim, yes. Self-mastery isn't about perfection, but about taking ownership responsibility for your choices and reactions. It's about resilience when things get tough and living with authenticity true to your values.
And it contrasts chasing fleeting happiness with seeking inner peace. using ideas like non-attachment.
It does draw on some concepts, maybe echoing Buddhist philosophy there. The idea that constantly needing external things to be a certain way leads to disappointment. Non-attachment isn't about apathy, not caring.
Right.
It's more about finding contentment within, regardless of whether things go exactly as planned. It's about releasing that tight grip on specific outcomes.
So accepting life's ups and downs with more grace.
Something like that. It ultimately circles back to seeing challenges not as roadblocks, but as, well, part of the path. Opportunities to learn, to grow, to become more fully yourself. The example of Maria finding peace by redefining success internally rather than seeking external validation really illustrates that.
That's powerful. Okay, so for you listening, wanting to apply some of this, what are the key practical takeaways? The source suggests journaling.
Yeah, journaling about those triggers we talked about, the fears that might be underneath, but also your goals, that future self.
And visualization, making time for that.
Daily visualization of that highest potential self, yes, making it vivid.
And those micro shifts. Pick one small thing.
Identify one small, doable change to practice daily, building that EI muscle.
And maybe the foundation for all of it. Self-compassion.
Definitely. Be kind to yourself through the process. It's a journey, not a quick fix.
We should add a little nuance here. But we did get some feedback that while the source material is deep, it can sometimes feel a bit repetitive. Or maybe it gets less specific with actionable steps later on.
That's a fair point, some might find. It lays a really strong theoretical groundwork, digging into the why, but the how towards the end relies quite heavily on the reader doing that deep internal work, the introspection.
Right, and that heavy focus on looking inward, while valuable, could potentially feel a bit much for someone looking for very concrete, immediate strategies, maybe.
It could, depending on what you're looking for. It's definitely more geared towards understanding the deep roots than providing a quick checklist.
But that said, the psychological depth and those really relatable metaphors like the mountain itself, that's where the real strength seems to lie, especially for people committed to that longer-term personal growth journey.
I'd agree. For understanding the dynamics of self-sabotage, it offers a really valuable framework.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive, the big message seems to be what we call self-sabotage is often, maybe usually, this kind of tangled attempt at self-protection. It stems from fears and needs we might not even be aware of.
And understanding that inner mountain, getting to know our internal landscape through self-awareness and building emotional intelligence, that's really the key to breaking those cycles and moving towards, well, growth and self-mastery.
So here's a final thought for you to mull over. Think about one pattern in your life, something you might label self-sabotage. Reflecting on our chat today, what hidden need or fear could possibly be driving it? Just speculate. And then what's just one tiny micro shift you could maybe try this week, just as an experiment, to understand that pattern a little better?
Food for thought.
Definitely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.